Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Traces.Dreams and FutureFramedTV. I'm joined today by philosopher Tim Dean. Tim, welcome.
Hi, Paul. Great to be here.
Before we jump in with the first question, what is normal? What perspectives and experiences do you bring to this question?
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about normality on the lead up to this and my experiences with it. And I think my first kind of appreciation of the concept of normality was realizing, I suppose, sometime around my teenage years, that I wasn't necessarily normal. So there's a certain kind of point where you start to ask questions of your friends and you're like, what do you think about it? Do you get this experience, or how do you think? And you realize, hang on, you don't experience the world the same way I do. You don't feel the same way. You don't have the same kinds of expectations that I do. So all these little things, like, I don't know, I was never a very physical kid. I was more of spending time in the library, like a nerd, flipping through books and stuff. And I wasn't as big on going out on the playground and getting into roughhousing and playing bull rush, where the object of the game is to just try to stamp on people as much as you possibly can. Wasn't really my thing. And I didn't think much of that until I started to appreciate that, no, actually, most of the other boys my age, that is normal for them. That's what they do. So what does that make me? So am I kind of abnormal? And then you go through this process of kind of reflecting on yourself and the world and the expectations and your identity, all that stuff that happens in your teens and your early 20s. And eventually, I think, starting to come to terms with your identity as a unique person, where some things that you share with others are great and other things that are different are great, but it takes a while to really come to terms with that. So here's one like silly example, right? I remember lying on a field with a bunch of friends, I don't know, we were 16, just talking shit, looking at the stars. And I remember in a quiet moment saying, guys, do you hear ringing in your ears like all the time? And they're like, no. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing, because I've had tinnitus basically as long as I can remember. I think there was a little scuffle that I got into when I was like 12 years old, based on a misunderstanding, I should add, where I got hit in the head. And I think I've had tinnitus since then. But that was one of those examples where you're like, right, for me, ringing in my ears is normal, but not everyone else experiences that. And so then I suppose later in life, I really dived into philosophy. And so I'm a philosopher now. And
was
then
it tinnitus that did that? Did tinnitus send you on the journey?
It was, yeah, the existential dread of an absence of silence. I don't know. But then I started to get the tools to start to reflect on this kind of stuff a bit more methodically, and start to reflect on, what does normal really mean, and where do I sit in that, and where does identity fit in? And this is still an ongoing thing, right? But at least I've got a few more tools in the kit to play around with.
I so badly wanted to jump in at the beginning to make a really bad joke about, what teenager is normal. But I didn't want to detract from a really lovely point, which is it very much is a coming of age question, isn't it? It's very much a question that once you realize that other people experience the world differently, that what is normal, it starts to get played with. The way in which your parents do something at home is different from the way that other people's parents do things at their home, is one of the first steps towards realizing that different people's worlds operate and are experienced differently. I don't want to foreshadow too much of what you may or may not say.
No, I totally agree. Yeah.
In response to the question, what is normal?
So what I'm going to do here is kind of bring some of the philosophy to bear on this. And what a philosopher, what we want to do when we hear a question like that, is we want to answer it kind of from our experience, or we want to answer it to say, given what we think normal is, what fits into that category. But what a philosopher would like to usually do is to say, instead of saying, given what we think normal is, let's say, let's stop and think about what normal is for a moment. So let's start talking about what is normal. Let's talk about what does normal mean. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about this in terms of how we define normal and how that informs the way we think. And so my background, my interest in philosophy is fairly wide, but ethics is the main kind of thing. And it's no accident that when we talk about how people should behave morally, we talk about moral norms. So right there, we have this idea that normality and norms are telling us the way things should be. There's a kind of a prescriptive element to it. But of course, then we talk about like statistical averages. What's a normal height? What's a normal weight? And we want to kind of talk about, the people around us and the experiences that we've had. What's kind of in the middle of that? So I think what we've got is generally these two aspects of normality. Whenever we use the word, we're talking about one or both of these things. One is a descriptive thing, just like an averaging, and one is a prescriptive thing, like an idealization. What should things be? So there's the descriptive and the prescriptive, and they play together and they inform each other in a way that we don't always, I don't think we really realize that we've got these two dimensions of it. What I think can sometimes happen is we absorb the statistical averages, but then we give them a kind of an idealization where we say a normal height, statistically average height, becomes like, the not just the typical, but also we see things that are above that as being good and below that as being bad, or weight is might probably a better example. And so I think there's kind of interesting thing where they inform each other. Sometimes we could become taught about what's right and wrong, and then we start to expect that the world will be reflecting that in its averages. And we see deviation from that as not just wrong, but abnormal. And then we absorb like just the averages of the things around us, and we start to think that that's also kind of good and bad. And I think if we don't reflect on how these two things interplay, we can jump to some conclusions based upon one bleeding into the other.
Yeah, I really like the idea of how you framed that, how on the one hand, normal is a descriptive term, but on the other hand, normal can also become, and is very often, a prescriptive term. And can we delve a little bit more into normal as morality, or morality as, or moral norms, as you were talking about? Because I think let's push discussion of descriptive norms aside for the moment, because I think unpacking moral norms gives us a better handle and more control over the way in which we want to operate in the world. Because I think sometimes we just assume moral norms and we run with them, but we don't question or challenge them. And I think if we can gain more control over the moral norms, then maybe we can gain more authority over how we interface with descriptive norms. Moral norms. Can you give me maybe an example to kick off a discussion?
Yeah, in a way, a moral norm is like an expectation with extra punch. So we expect people to behave a certain way. And it's not just if they don't behave that way, we're just like, wow. We're like, that's bad. We want to punish them if they don't behave that way. So, I mean, there's so many different kinds of moral norms. I mean, Christmas is coming up. So let's think about all the, and the thing is, a lot of these moral norms are invisible to us. They're just kind of, we're saturated in them. We're enveloped in them, and we don't really think too much about them. But let's think, what if you received a gift, which was a regifting of something that you gave that person the previous year?
I mean, I would never do that. I would never give someone anything, especially if it was not, fruitcake would definitely not be something I would re-give at all, ever.
Yeah, right. Well, see, now you're ahead of the game there. But what's also quite interesting is, and whether this is a moral norm, I don't want to weigh too much on the moral. I'm just weighing on the kind of prescriptive expectation side of it. The idea that what makes a kind of a norm like this is that when someone breaks it, we judge it negatively. We think that there's something bad that's going on. And right there, right, just even in this norm about, say, regifting, that can change between cultures. There's a lot of cultures where gifts are not something that are just kind of a one-way street and stop. They're circular. They flow through a community. And it's a form of expressing care and respecting status and building trust and all that kind of stuff. The actual object doesn't really matter so much. You're not giving someone a kettle so they can use it. You're giving someone a kettle because it's beautiful and it represents something about your relationship. And then they give it to someone else, and then you give them, and they give you back something. And that whole kind of network of reciprocity changes the norms and the expectations around gift giving. But we have these norms about regifting where we live in the West, and we don't necessarily know that they're there. But then talking about the kind of relationship between the descriptive and the prescriptive, let's say over the course of a few years, people started really talking up regifting. They said, look, it's better for the environment. Let's start sharing. Let's start, let's not waste things. Let's give things people that are beautiful, that they can move around. That norm might change. We might change. And that norm might change because of our expectations. Maybe over the course of a Christmas, we receive 5 really nice regifted things, and we give a couple next Christmas, and then 3 or 4 years later, that's the norm. So the descriptive and the expectation, the statistical average, can start to inform what we think is normal.
I really loved how you described moral norms as expectations with a punch. Because, I was re-gifted a fruitcake once, and
That's why you brought it up.
in a Chris Kindle, and I really wanted to punch the guy who re-gifted me the fruitcake. I would never punch anyone, but except in self-defense. But, it wraps up beautifully the visceral response we have to moments when someone traverses a moral norm.
Mm.
The very, the reaction we have. And the reason I think having a discussion about this is so important is because, you can stop and think, and okay, I'm having a visceral response right now because I was re-gifted something, but was it consequential that this was re-gifted? And if we can just break that reaction just for a moment and press the pause button, we can actually think about these norms and go, oh, well, actually, this is a moment to reflect. Maybe there's a new discussion to have. Maybe the circular economy is a better thing. And the fact that he didn't throw the fruitcake that he didn't want to eat into the bin and gave it to me instead is actually not wasteful. And so by pressing the pause button on my visceral reaction to prescriptive norms, we can enter into a more, dare I say it, holistic conversation about how we want to operate and live and interact with the people around us and the rest of nature.
Look, and that's so interesting. I mean, let me just get out of the way. Was this a year between fruitcake gifts?
It must have been. Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
That's got some stamina, that fruitcake. But look, putting that aside,
fruitcake.
What you've described there is a really interesting distinction in ethics. And it's something I'm really interested in as well. Between, you talked about the immediate visceral reaction that we get when we see someone violating a norm. We know from moral psychology the steps that we go through. We see something that we perceive to be wrong. We feel an immediate sense of outrage, and outrage often motivates us to punish the wrongdoer. And this is a deep psychological process that is rooted in our long evolutionary past. Because really, when we lived maybe 150,000 years ago in very small communities, there were no police, there were no institutions, there was no one else to solve our problems for us. If we saw some wrongdoing, we had to deal with it. But punishing someone directly is also pretty dangerous. Like if someone does something wrong to you and you step out, think about it like if you're in the line at the supermarket and someone cuts in front of you, you feel that outrage and you want to kind of say something to them, but often we don't, because we're a little bit afraid of what might happen. Is this person going to lash out at us? So in a way, outrage was a mechanism that we use that has these two interesting functions. One is it gets our blood up, so it makes us more likely to actually step out and punish the wrongdoer. But it's something we share with others. We share that outrage. We say, did you see that? And you make them outraged. And then you create a coalition, and together you work to punish the wrongdoer.
It's very much about in-group, out-group dynamics, isn't it? It's about social inclusion, social exclusion.
Well, it can be. I mean, it can work within in-groups as well. But certainly the thing that stops you punishing, that's really where the in-group, out-group variation happens. So if someone does something wrong within your in-group, you still might want to punish them, but your sense of loyalty might overwhelm that. Whereas if they're an out-group, you might dehumanize them. You might not see them as being morally worthwhile. And your likelihood to punish is kind of unhindered. You're just kind of, you barrel straight ahead. But the second thing that you said is when we pause, when we stop for a moment and think about what's going on there, we're activating a different moral processing system. We're activating a more rational, reflective, and consequentialist system where we think about, if I do this, is this going to make the world a better place? Is this going to fix this? Is this going to cause a problem there? And we can start kind of processing a much bigger, more holistic kind of view of things. The thing is, that's a slower, more laborious form of moral thinking. And it's harder to activate because the outrage wants to shout it down. The outrage wants to scream us into action. But there is this interesting tension between these two. And the reason I'm interested in them is where I think the first process, the outrage process, which is kind of more of a simpler response to a stimulus, was probably really effective 100 and something thousand years ago. It's not that effective now. And we see this playing out on things like social media. We see people break norms and then people get outraged. and they share that outrage and they cancel that person, they hassle that, they get the person fired or something. And sometimes that punishment might be reasonable, but sometimes that punishment might be disproportionate to what's been going on, because that second process of like, hang on a second, is this really in accordance with our values? Is this really going to make the world a better place? That more rational process doesn't have a chance to kick in and temper the outrage. So I think the outrage sometimes kind of is mismatched with the world that we're living in today. But it's still very difficult sometimes to stop the outrage in order to think more carefully about outcomes, about consequences.
Returning to the way in which prescriptive and descriptive norms can bleed into each other, that moral outrage that we can experience is an interesting one to observe when it bleeds into things like seeing a large person walking down the street. You know, someone sees a fat person down the street, and then there's a certain kind of descriptive norm that we have about the average person that bleeds into seeing that person as deviant or an outlier. And suddenly and I've seen this firsthand, more so a decade or 2 decades ago, when people would voice body shaming opinions much more openly than they would now. But it's an example for me where that moral outrage has bled into a very arbitrary category where that person's body weight is not impacting anyone else around them. They're not hurting anyone by being overweight or by being obese or by being larger than other people in the group. And yet the descriptive norm about the average body weight, the average BMI, has bled into a prescriptive norm, and people suddenly have moral outrage over things that actually aren't affecting them. It's not like the person, we're not talking about a scenario where that large person has cut in front of you in line. We're talking about just, seeing the larger person. And I think there's a few interesting strands to what you've introduced into the discussion. One being, the way in which moral outrage may have functioned in small groups as opposed to how 100, 200 years ago or more, as opposed to how that moral outrage plays out online or en masse. And, to follow that discussion for a second, we had an example of that in the Sydney theatre scene just recently.
Oh, yeah.
Where we saw Hedwig and the Angry Inch cancelled because the actor who had been cast in the role of Hedwig wasn't deemed queer enough for the role. And so certain people got online and said, we should have a transgender person doing this role. We shouldn't have this guy who isn't flagrantly open about his sexuality online. And it was kind of upsetting because that moral outrage and the use of that moral outrage to forward a particular political discourse had consequences for an entire season of a show, for an actor's career, because he wasn't subscribing to the gender norms of a particular group who are vocal about their sexuality because they don't want people telling them how to express their gender. So you get into these really complicated stories, and then you look at the script at the end of the day, and the script is, the person who is in the lead role, it actually plays 2 different roles, and then there's the big reveal at the end that he's actually got a man's body. So in fact, it's completely in line with the script itself that a physical male portrays the role of Hedwig in this particular show.
Yeah, right.
So sometimes that the moral outrage that people can have about the norms that they want to promote can snowball and become completely disjointed from the original stimulus, but the fallout can be huge.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack in there. One of the things that I think is interesting, talking about normality, is for most of human history, if human history went over 24 hours, for the last 11 3/4 hours, 23 3/4 hours of human history, we lived in communities where there was only one normal. There was one shared set of normal. And it wasn't up to us to decide what that normal was. It was imposed upon us by our culture, by the authorities in our culture, or by history or by tradition. And in a way, it was very oppressive, which is why we've pushed back against that in recent years through liberalism, particularly, to allow greater diversity of opinions about what the world should look like. But really, our minds are still used to this idea of us living in and wanting to live in a community with one single shared set of norms. Because while it was oppressive to be told what is normal, it was also liberating to not have to figure it out for ourselves, to not have to have an attitude and a belief about what we think is right and wrong, and then see others who disagree with that and have to tolerate them. Tolerance is not a part of our nature. We're not naturally very tolerant creatures. We are naturally highly conformist creatures. And we know this. There's a lot of really amazing studies talking about like how we get a sense of normality, which maybe we can talk a little bit more about the development later. But like they've done these studies where they get a room full of people who are all kind of stooges for the researcher in a boardroom making a decision, and they drop one subject into that room and they make this decision together. And the decision that they make is something really absurd, really obviously bizarre. They express these really strange beliefs. And the thing is, the subject dropped in there will vastly more likely than not accept those beliefs as being true. They will accept those decisions. They'll conform with the majority view. That's our nature. It's our nature to do that. And so what we talk about this mismatch, and the reason I talk about this mismatch is I've been thinking a lot about this, particularly this year, because I've been writing a book about how our evolved moral psychology works and how it used to work really well in a lot of situations and how it's not working so well in our modern world. We are used to kind of living in these homogenous environments. We're suddenly living in this highly diverse, multicultural, globalist world. We jump onto social media. We're exposed to people's views and attitudes from all over the world, but also within our own nation. And what we see is not conformity. We see a lot of people who are deviating from what we think is right and wrong. And we want to respond to them as if we were still living in a small community. We want to punish them. We want to bring them into line. So I think bringing it back to your example about the play, I think what that could be is one particular community who, when they talk to each other, reinforce their ideas of normal and conformity, are then confronted with someone who's out of step with that. And they want to try to control them, push them down, change their views. Yet there are going to be other people who hold different views. There are going to be other people who hold different values and different things. And we're not good at negotiation. We're not good at compromise. We're not good at toleration. This is something that requires us to suppress that immediate outrage and take a moment, hit the pause button, and start a conversation. And I mean, there's a lot of talk about us not being as good at this kind of civil engagement now than we used to be. I don't think we've ever been very good at it. Maybe in the last couple of hundred years through philosophical liberalism, encouraging diversity, tolerance, and engagement and civility. That was a bit of a blip, really. It's not really gonna. I'm not surprised it hasn't lasted. But we struggle. We struggle because we want the world to conform to our ideas of normal and our expectations, and we're not very good at handling it when it doesn't.
I'm excited about this book that you're writing, especially these themes that you're telling us about. And I just want to recap and paraphrase as best I can what you said about we live in a globalized world, but we still try to moralize others as though we were living in small communities. Because that for me captures very much that we may not really have adapted to the globalized world. I mean, given the speed that the world has changed and globalized so rapidly, the psychological toolkit that we're bringing to that world is still is a little bit outdated.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think mainly the toolkit, like you said, with the outrage, it's that toolkit, that immediate response that we get. That's the heuristic, the shortcuts, the very quick and immediate responses, which are more heavily influenced by our evolutionary past. That's the toolkit that's mismatched. The second system, where we stop and hit the pause button and we can think about it, that's incredibly flexible. That's very, very powerful. That's very adaptable. We can use that to live in this kind of world, and we have. But we're always tempted to go back to the shortcuts. We're always tempted to not hit that pause button. And I think we see a lot of that today. And a lot of this is influenced by our environment as well. Like, I think through the 20th century, we lived in these big nation states that were slowly becoming, well, the late 20th century, we were slowly becoming more multicultural. But we didn't have social media, so we didn't have the ability to cordon ourselves off and recreate these little communities of agreement and conformity. So when we read the national newspapers, we were getting all these different views, and we just had to kind of suck it up. We had to somehow suppress a little bit our immediate emotional outrage. It was still there. People get together to have a beer and go to a barbecue and complain about the world, but that we were tolerating it a bit more. But with social media, we've recreated this ability for us to form into these little cliques.
Yeah.
We feel great. We feel so good when we find our people. Then that encourages us to have conflicts with other people.
The geometry of the relationship in media predating the internet was strongly weighted towards being a one-way communication.
Yeah.
Whereas now with social media, what you're saying is we can have, well, multi-way conversation. It's not just media and the population, it's media and people interacting with the media and people interacting with other networks online through various different online networks and impacting these discussions. One exciting thing I would pick up though is the fact, for me, I think that it is exciting, particularly for marginal groups that, or people with, for example, really rare diseases. It's an opportunity for them to create networks that would never have been possible in small communities in the first place. And in some ways, the discussion about diversity really came to the front page of media through people recognizing other people's marginal experiences because they understand their own. You know, migrant communities and gay communities and Indigenous communities, people started to recognize diversity because they might not have been gay, but they might have been a migrant, or they might not have been Indigenous, but they might have had the marginal experience of someone with a rare chronic ailment. And so they might not have understood the experience, that person's experience of whatever their particular experience of diversity was, but they did recognize the marginality. And I think that has created a very strong platform for people to enter into those discussions. And what you're prompting me to think, and I'll need to go off and think about this because you've given us a lot of food for thought. So I'm going to have to sit down with your book when it comes out and really nut this out of my own head. But even though we might recognize marginality, we still are very self-centered in the way in which we want to impose our norms onto other people and other groups. When's the book coming out?
It should be coming out around the middle of this year, maybe August, September this year. Still a bit of editing to do on it yet, but it's on its way. But look, one thing I want to pick up on what you're talking about there is yes, the internet has allowed these more marginalized voices to be heard, and I think that's a good thing. But for many people, that was also felt quite threatening. And I want to explain that not in a judgmental way. I don't want to say these people should or shouldn't be threatened. I just want to describe how they felt and the way they see the world. They saw the world, they grew up in maybe smaller communities that were fairly homogenous, like in terms of what we think normal is. Basically what normal is what the world looked like until we were 15 years old. Whatever the world looked like around us in our immediate environment until we were the age of 15, physically, the faces we saw, the colors of the faces that we saw, the languages we heard, and the norms that we absorbed, the social expectations that we absorbed, that's really the baggage that we take with us for the rest of our life. And we're quite flexible and plastic up to that point, but then we become quite much harder to change after that time. And this is one of the reasons why people who are 50, 60, 70 years old today have been slower to move on progressive issues, because for them, they absorbed these norms in a very different kind of social environment. And young people who were much more flexible today struggle to understand how these people are being resistant to things like same-sex marriage.
I think that is perhaps also new to this equation is, I might be guessing here, but in small communities over 200 years ago, I don't think there was as much generational conflict about what those norms should or should not be.
No, you're absolutely right.
Whereas in particularly the last 50 years, if not the last 100 years, there's been a lot more generational conflict about social norms.
Look, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I remember a story my dad told me. My dad was born in the 1920s, so he had me very late in life. And he said that he saw this really interesting transition between his childhood and then the kind of boomers, the baby boomers who were being born in the 40s and the 50s. He said in his world, he looked forward to the day when he could start wearing the clothes that his father wore. So his father wore particular kinds of suits and all that kind of stuff. And when he was a kid, he wore shorts. He was growing up in London, cold, but they wear shorts, And when you get to a certain age, 13, 14, 15 years old, you can start wearing your father's clothes, and that's like a rite of passage. But that shows there's a kind of a continuity of culture there. His culture was segmented by class and wealth. So if you were an East Ender, as he was, he would not be wearing the same clothes as someone from Chelsea, as someone from a country manor, no matter what age they were, but he would be wearing the same clothes as his father and grandfather in his particular class. And in the 50s, particularly, that flipped to being horizontally split. So really, no matter whether you were rich or poor or whatever, you had the same styles of your age, of the teenage years, and then your 20s, and then you go through these different phases where a part of growing up as a teenager is rejecting what your parents wear. So that, talking about normality, right? You absorb, instead of absorbing normality from your parents as a teenager, you absorb it from your peers as a teenager. And we know from studies that the single greatest influence on teenagers. So when you're up to about the age 12, what you think is right and wrong and what you wear and everything comes from your parents. From about the age 13, 14, 15 onwards, it's all about your peers. And so that kind of changes the dynamics generationally. I suspect, I don't know if this is true, but I suspect that's because the pace of change, the pace of social change picked up dramatically in the mid-20th century. So the living conditions, the financial, the economic, the educational, the cultural, all of these different things changed generations much more quickly. So the 20 years down the track, your kids were growing up in a different world. They kind of had to be a bit different from their parents.
There's been so many influences, but one of the biggest influences on having so much peer input into the moral norms that you adopt for the rest of your life is possibly because of how we outsourced education from the family to the state, and how we had, public education where kids were taken away from their families from, 9 to 5 or 8 to 3 or whatever, and given a state-based pedagogy in numerous countries around the world, almost globally now, which is kind of a unique blip in the history of humankind.
It's really only the last couple of 100 years that we've been doing that. It's really only the last 100 years and 100 years and change, that it's been compulsory in most countries for that to be the case.
Somehow my brain has also gone on a tangent thinking about Michael Pollan's book about psychedelic drugs. He talks about, LSD was the first time where adolescents and youngsters had rituals that their parents had never gone through. And it fostered a very difficult intergenerational dynamic where adolescents were coming up with rituals between themselves with this new drug that had never been experienced before. And, parents were no longer in control of this. The state wasn't in control of it. And one of the reasons that he believes that psychedelics are so highly policed is because what's happening inside someone's head is no longer under the control of the state or under control of the family unit.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and that makes a lot of sense to me. In fact, my understanding in 1966, when the US banned LSD, the justification was not really on health grounds. There was no evidence, particularly, that it had any particular negative health effects. The worst they could say about it is it was a psychomimetic. It mimicked other psychological conditions, but it wasn't reliably, shown to do that. It wasn't particularly dangerous, but because it was subversive to the culture. They were really worried that it was not just, like you're saying, it's a ritual. It's a really good way of putting it. It was a ritual that wasn't shared with their elders, but it was a ritual that also encouraged the young people to rethink the way the world was and the norms and the expectations. And I think anyone who's ever taken LSD will know that one of the interesting things that it does is we naturally divide the world into things and not things. That's a chair, that's a table, chair's not a table, table's not a chair. And we categorize and carve the world up into objects that have distinct identities. One of the things that LSD does is it it blurs those distinctions. And that's not that I'm just using a physical example there, but it blurs those distinctions psychologically. You cannot for a while tell the difference between me and you and them. And it also blurs the distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable. So we're talking about normality being having a descriptive and a prescriptive component. That starts to blend together as well, where you start to kind of, you can see all the descriptive stuff without any judgment, without the prescriptive. But then you have all these ideas about, what's kind of good and everything in the world, and you relax yourself from the baggage of being told what's good to just see the world as it is. That's very subversive as well. I can see that the elders would have had seen a huge threat in a generation doing that.
I feel like this is a good time to enter into the discussion the idea that the bleeding between descriptive and prescriptive norms is not necessarily benign, and it isn't necessarily by accident, but sometimes very purposefully done by the state in regards to wanting particular kinds of body types to be their armed forces, they're productive members of society. Being able to describe someone's productivity in terms of norms, which is a descriptive norm, became a prescriptive norm because countries wanted to build up their wealth. Nations wanted to build up their productivity and their economic status in the world. But then there was also the corporations that came in and started actively fostering the bleeding of these categories between descriptive and prescriptive norms by saying things like, "Oh, cellulite. Oh, we should fix that." And halitosis. Oh, yeah. Well, we have a product that can get rid of the bad breath that is actually quite normal, but we don't want that anymore. Here's some Listerine, and even rhitids. Crow's feet on your eyes, and all these wrinkles. Things like that, where it's just a descriptive norm to say that, well, in this particular sample population, we don't see these norms. Often, young people that happen to be the ideal sample population for this company to sell their product. So I think that there are some forces behind the scenes who are capitalizing on the ways in which descriptive norms become prescriptive norms.
Look, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's how the advertising industry works. It creates an expectation about what you're supposed to look like, how you're supposed to live, what success looks like. The state gets, I think it was a really good point that you made about the fact that states are in economic competition with each other. It means that they've all got an incentive to try to boost their economic output. And so they want to turn their citizens into economic agents. We could be anything, right? We could all be going and living and camping in the bush in perpetuity, probably, at a different standard of living, but is it a better or worse standard of well-being? I mean, that's an open question, right? But it would be a devastating effect on our economy if we did that. If we shifted to a barter economy or something like, reciprocal Christmas presents we were talking about earlier, that would have a devastating effect on the bauble industry, So yes, of course, I think that there's a lot of incentive for some who can benefit from us absorbing particular norms and expectations, because we will then try to achieve those things. And a lot of those norms and expectations that are put upon us are really corrosive. And some of them don't necessarily come from consumer culture. Some of them come from just society in general, like status. We think that it's not only normal to want status, but it's admirable to have high status. But really, status is just bullshit. Status is one of the most hollow things in life that you can try to pursue. It's fleeting. It's an infinite thing in that the more that you have, the more that you need to fight to keep it and to get more. And it's known that status chasing is really corrosive to our well-being. But we have this thrust upon us. And I mean, I work a lot with young people, and I ask them about the careers that they want to do. And so often it's informed either by their parents' expectations, and their ideas are normal, or a societal expectation that if they're smart, they must be a doctor or a lawyer or something, even if they want to be an artist or a writer or whatever. And so those kinds of norms are thrust upon us without us really realizing they're there, and they're often not very good for us.
In some ways, I feel like we're here going, well, we want everyone to have large prefrontal cortexes and to engage their prefrontal cortex more. And we're just, or at least I am, just wanting another norm to go viral. Well, what questions do you think would be constructive for us to ask about norms?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I think because our sense of normality is absorbed at this really unconscious level, it paints the world around us. Most of our brain is devoted to filtering stuff out and interpreting what we see rather than kind of making sense of things. So the stuff that we actually think about is already being flavored by our perception. And the normality, our sense of normality operates at that perceptual level, not at the rarely at the cognitive level, unless we really stop and think about it. And so one thing I encourage lots of people to think about this is do it through the vehicle of challenging common sense. So I think most common sense is bullshit. Most of the time, when we invoke common sense, we are doing it because someone's doing something we think is not common sense. We say it's just common sense, as if it's a conversation stopper. When you find yourself using the term common sense, I think it's a really good opportunity to hit that pause button, to hear yourself say something and say, where's that coming from? Because I suspect that most of the time, all you're saying when you say something is common sense is you're saying, this is obvious to my unreflective expectations about the way the world is. And if someone thinks something is not, or disagrees with your sense of common sense, you saying it's common sense is not going to persuade them because they have a different unreflective sense of what's normal, where your common sense is not obvious to them. So the key is to reflect on where is that coming from in your own, where are those attitudes coming from? What even are those attitudes? We are notoriously bad at reflecting on what our actual beliefs and attitudes are. This is a good opportunity when you think there's common sense. Well, okay, what does that mean? Bring them to the surface. Think when you're engaging with other people who disagree with you. What are their attitudes? Ask them questions. Bring them to the surface. And then we might be able to engage with difference and disagreement on a more genuine level rather than just hurling our expectations and assumptions in each other's face.
I feel that would generate so much innovation too, because if you question common sense, you are actually inviting a moment to reconsider the framework with which you are operating and to create new frameworks. And I think that's really a productive space for innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be. Yeah.
Tim, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure having you on Idioms of Normality, and we look forward to reading your book in 2021.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So welcome. Thanks for having me, man.